can we know what it was like to live in that destiny without actually living in that era? Do you know how you feel about that?
That is,
as a curator, historian.
School kids today, I mean, I'm very focused on how young people view this subject matter. You've got kids today who are navigating such tremendous difficulties dealing with school shootings and, you know, the post 9/11 world. It's difficult sometimes for young people to see this event as anything more than the death of one man, and how can one man be of such significance that people often compare it to the bombing of Pearl Harbor or 9/11. And so it all, I think, comes down to the context of that time. Kennedy, you know, you look at that time period. Dwight Eisenhower, respected World War II general, the oldest president in American history, which suddenly gives way to the youngest man ever elected. Kennedy's the first president born in the 20th century. He ushers in this new frontier program, a very kind of progressive outlook for the time.
Yes.
He's interested in civil rights. He's interested in women's rights. He engages young people and he speaks to young people in a way they had never been addressed before by a politician.
Yes.
It's not that it doesn't matter if you're not old enough to vote. You can still ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country, because you're part of that new generation the torch is being passed to. I mean, that inaugural address was meant for young people, not those who necessarily voted for Kennedy, but for the ones who were coming ahead. The ones who would maybe be inspired by Kennedy to join the Peace Corps, to ultimately become civil rights activists or even protest the Vietnam War. Right. Kennedy in many ways created an informed generation of young people who had never paid attention to politics because a politician had never looked or sounded like John F. Kennedy before, had never had that presence on television.
Right.
When you take all of that and then you bring him here, and he dies in such a horrifically violent fashion, captured on film, it is almost Shakespearean in its tragedy. Yeah. Suddenly you have all of that unfulfilled hope and promise kind of embodied here in Dealey Plaza. What might have happened if Kennedy had lived? Would he have won in 1964? Would the Vietnam War have been escalated? Would we have had the passage of the civil rights legislation in July of 1964, or would it have been a longer road ahead? Would Freedom Summer in 1964 have taken place?
Right.
Would Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and Harvey Milk and all the other assassinations that followed in this cascade of violence after Dallas in 1963, would that have happened? And so that is such a tantalizing what if, that you have the assassination becoming the subject of dozens of science fiction novels and TV shows and movies. Stephen King wrote an entire novel about what if. It infected a generation, really. It broke a generation. These people who came of age in the 50s and 60s, this was the moment that defined them. This was the moment when it all went wrong. So naturally there is this inclination to want to go back and fix things and change history. And so communicating that story, communicating that generational shift and all of that emotional baggage that leads us on into the government mistrust and the investigations into abuses by the intelligence communities in the 70s, on and on to the Oliver Stone film, communicating the significance of what came before and what came after and how everything kind of just turned on November 22nd, 1963 is a challenging thing, and it's something that we are very focused on with every program, exhibit, educational initiative. It's one of the reasons why we are continuing to grow and evolve our oral history project. Yeah. We have about 2,500 recordings in that project.
Amazing.
And so many are 1960s school kids from coast to coast and from around the world sharing that commonality of experience, having lived through the moment of the assassination, in the hopes that maybe presenting the recollections of a 1963 fourth grader to a group of fourth graders in 2024, 60 years later. Right. Well, there might be some common bond because, in the end, history at its best builds bridges of communication between those generations.